You're listening to The Rawha, Daily Guidance for Seekers with Shaykh Faraz Rabbani.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa afdalus salati wa tammut taslim. Ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyina wa Habibina Muhammad. Wa ala alihi. Wa sahbihi. Wa sallama tasliman kathira. Allahumma lakal hamd. Ala ma an'amta alayna. Min ni'amin la tuhsa ya Rabbil Alameen. Faj'alna Allahumma min ibadika ash-shakirin al-dhakirin. لأنعمك يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah, in our sessions on healing hearts, in which we're looking at Imam al-Sulami's treatise on the blameworthy traits of the self and how to treat or how to cure those blameworthy traits, we have reached trait number 9. We have reached trait number 9. And this has to do with bad thoughts. And one of the amazing insights in the Quran is its practical presentation of the human reality, right? Because all people have wondered about what is the human being and how do we aspire to that which is higher, that which is beneficial, that which is good, that which is virtuous, that which is right. And then wondering, what does all that mean? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not simply present us a book of guidance with what to do and what is the ultimately higher way, what is good, what is virtue, what is benefit, truly. But it also tells us about the human condition. And one of the insights about the human condition is the insight that being a morally responsible person, you are responsible for your choices, because moral responsibility arises from choices. And choices arise from thoughts. Now, you are not responsible for when the thoughts emerge, the first thought, but you are responsible for how you respond to the thoughts that emerge in your consciousness. That whatever consciousness may be in itself, it is practically undeniable that thoughts arise. There are different types of thoughts. And they have things that stir good thoughts or bad thoughts, virtuous thoughts, vicious thoughts, meaningful thoughts, meaningless thoughts. You are not responsible for those, but you are responsible for which thoughts you embrace, accept, and act upon, and which thoughts you ignore, reject, and refuse. So, he tells us in the 9th trait, وَمِنْ عُيُوبِهَا أَنَّهَا تَأْلَفُ الْخَوَاطِرَ الرَّدِيئَةَ فَتَسْتَحْكِمُ عَلَيْهَا الْمُخَالَفَاتِ. Right? From the blameworthy traits of the self is that it accepts lowly thoughts. Right? It accepts, it becomes ta'laf, it becomes accustomed to accepting lowly thoughts. Right? It finds comfort in them. And which cause it to commit contraventions. Okay? And then he tells us about the cure for this. Right? So, the ulama tell us that there are 4 types of inspirations. Right? The first of these, now of course ultimately every thought is a created thing and it is all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. قُلْ كُلٌّ مِّنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ. It is all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The names that are given for them are in terms of what the thought is calling you to and how you deal with it. Because the reality is, it is all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So we should be clear about that. The first type of thought is al-Khatir al-Rabbani, the lordly inspiration. Right? And these are thoughts that occur to one that inspire us to meanings of faith, meanings of certitude. Right? And really the action that relates to them is embracing them, is accepting them, embracing them, and nurturing them. Right? Accepting, embracing, and nurturing. How does one nurture them? Through reflection and remembrance. Right? So, sometimes, let's say, you're standing and you see the sunset and you think about how glorious Allah's creation is, how glorious Allah's creating is. And you think about the amazing power of Allah. You say, yeah. And then you say, okay, let me check my smartphone and see what the score is of the whatever meaningless thing. But there, you accept that thought, you embrace it, and you nurture it. How? Bil-fikri wa dhikr. Right? Or al-fikr, with reflection and remembrance. Right? Or both. You reflect on it and you engage in dhikr. And that expands the impact of that thought. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ was so frequently silent. Because he was silent, one of the causes of silence was reflection. Right? The second type of inspiration that emerges in our consciousness is an angelic inspiration. And that is what's called the Khatir al-Malaki, which is an angelic inspiration that is an inclination towards a good action or towards something that is virtuous. So you're passing by someone in need, the inclination to give. You get that inclination, let me call so-and-so. Let me message so-and-so who would be happy by receiving that message. Someone just had a child, you say, yeah, I'll get to it later. It was an angelic inspiration. Let me contact them. Right? And again, these are good inspirations. We embrace angelic inspirations. We accept them. We embrace them. And we nurture them. And the nurturing of angelic inspirations is by acting upon them. By acting upon them. And you don't put off a good deed unnecessarily, particularly if it's something immediate. Right? So, if the opportunity comes to give, you see a message to assist those affected by a flood somewhere. Say, yeah, I'll donate. What's preventing you from giving it right now? Right? So, the nurturing of good is, as is common tradition, khairul birri ajiluhu. The best of virtue is the immediate. That you don't put it off. You don't put it off. And And then, so that's the angelic inspiration. Then you have the selfish inspiration, the khatir al-nafsani, which is an inclination towards desire, shahawat, or towards hawa, towards one's whim. Right? And these require, the asl with them is mukhalafa. Right? The basis of selfish inclinations is to oppose them. وَخَالِفِ النَّفْسَ وَالشَّيْطَانَ وَعْصِهِمَا. The basis is oppose your selfish urges and the devil and disobey them. Right? Rather, what do? You oppose and you consider how you can turn the selfish inclination into an angelic inclination. How? By turning it into something good and virtuous through the elixir, the elixir of intention. Right? So, for example, you get an inclination. I want pizza tonight. Right? You oppose that inclination that I want. Right? You oppose that inclination. First. Second step is you consider. Can I turn this into an angelic thing? Of course, if it's a pure sin, someone says, I want to do something purely sinful. You can't turn milk into wine, or wine into milk. Right? So, you can't turn it into an angelic inspiration, then you just leave it. But, for example, you're thinking, I want to have pizza tonight. You say, well, I'm supposed to meet up with my brother later in the week. We'll go for pizza. I'll treat him, he likes pizza, for example. Or you're saying, so-and-so is sick. I wanted to visit them. And if we'll order over there, because they like pizza a lot, they'll eat it the rest of the week. Whatever. You think of good intentions, where you direct permissible selfish desires towards the good, towards virtue, that which is virtuous. Right? You felt like having, some dessert. You want to try out that new baklava place? So you know what? I'll bring baklava to the weekly circle of remembrance. You'll save yourself some indulgence. Because if you just go eat it yourself, probably have a large portion size. Okay? Whereas, let's say you went and got something, so you turn selfish desires into angelic desires. How? By you oppose the selfish urge, but you direct them towards good and virtue. And this teaches restraint. And then there are satanic inspirations. Al-Khatir al-Shaytani, which is that which gives one doubt, that which gives one misgivings. And the doubts and misgivings can be in matters of faith, in what we believe about Allah, about His messengers, about the hereafter, or what Allah and His Messenger inform us about. Or they can be in the details of guidance. We can have doubts and misgivings there. Do I really need to do my sunnah? And there's a whole series of doubts, right? Confusions. Waswasa, for example, right? Did I wash my left elbow? Those kinds of things. So, and there's a lot how one deals with doubts and misgivings. There's a few things. the first aspect of dealing with the doubts of the doubts, Imam al-Sarakhsi says, وَالسَّبِيلُ فِي الْوَسْوَسَةِ وَالسَّبِيلُ فِي الْوَسَاوِسِ قَطْعُهَا وَعَدَمُ الْالْتِفَاتِ إِلَيْهَا. The way to handle doubts and misgivings is to cut their source and pay no attention to them. Okay? Simple. That is the general action. You don't pay attention to it. Yes. You just move on. Right? But sometimes that is not so easy. Some doubts, right? So you get a doubt about, so why do I believe in God? Just ignore that. So I believe, and you move on. You ignore a silly thought. Just as some outrageous sin, some sinful thought comes, you just ignore it and move on. Okay? So the first line of, the first reaction to a doubt is you ignore it. You pay no attention to it. And you renew your faith. Renew your faith in the sense that you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because the shaitan, how do we ignore the shaitan? By turning to Ar-Rahman. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. I seek refuge in Allah from the accursed devil. So when you get a doubt, you say A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. And you busy yourself with the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? And that as a first line of defense is sufficient. Don't busy yourself with these thoughts. But there are some persistent. Some doubts can be persistent. And their treatment is knowledge. Particularly those doubts that relate to faith, but also they're related to guidance. You need to find out what is the point of knowledge that this relates to. Then you gain the knowledge and then you act upon it. That's the second line of defense against waswas, against doubts and misgivings. First, you ignore them. Even when in practice, you get some doubt about wudu, whatever, you ignore it, move on. But if they persist, then the cause for doubt or misgiving is a lack of clarity. So you have to, what am I not clear about? Gain reliable knowledge on that. And that should be sufficient. And then you act upon that knowledge. If that is not sufficient, right? Similar, like you're confused that, does Allah create evil? Right? You ignore that. Like, where did that come from? You ignore it. Say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika la yuhyi wa yumit wa huwa ala kulli shay'in qadir. Right? I believe, there's no God but Allah, alone without partner. He gives life and He gives death, and He has power over all things, and you ignore. When it happens again, seek the relevant knowledge. Right? Seek the relevant knowledge. If that does not, if that second line of defense is seek the related knowledge, is that then consult. Then consult. Right? But I'm confused. I ignored it, but it keeps coming back. I try to, find out reliably what does that mean. I'm confused, and you seek clarity. But to remain in doubts and misgivings is detrimental. If the doubt relates to faith, it is it'll erode your faith. If it's related to guidance, it'll erode your attachment to guidance, and then it'll start affecting your faith. So it's harmful. And now, doubts sometimes can be explicit, sometimes they can be underlying doubts. It doesn't make sense. But you say, forget it. But it's a lingering doubt. And you have to be careful about lingering doubts, particularly in our times. when, the default is that people don't believe, right? People don't believe. People don't uphold prophetic guidance in the broader society, particularly if you're not in a Muslim country, right? So this, you can't just, if doubts come back and just ignoring them is not sufficient, or they're lingering, then you have to address them. And the safest line of defense, right, is to immediately consult, right? If you ignore, then you consult, and that's safer. But you consult people worthy of consulting, right? And too many people don't consult. They'll ask their teachers about secondary things, but they won't ask about the big things that are affecting them. Now, how do you tell if an inspiration, if a thought is lordly or satanic? Okay? Because sometimes it can be unclear, right? Sometimes, or how is this an angelic inspiration or a selfish inspiration? And this is a whole science, but they say that the clearest way of considering, that because, for example, let's say someone is crying. So you say, okay, I'll skip my sunnah and go and talk to them. But you know that so-and-so's mother passed away. So it's not like they're only going to cry now, right? They may be crying for a while. So for you to pray 2 rak'ahs and go to attend to them won't necessarily make a difference, right? And they say that the key thing is to consider consequences. What is the consequence of this inspiration? Is the likely result that which is in consequence pleasing to Allah, all things considered? Or is it something whose consequence is displeasing to Allah, all things considered? Why? Because let's say you get a thought. You just took a class on health. So you think, you want to tell, say, Shaykh Faraz, you should lose some weight. And you say, as soon as I sat on stage. Okay? Right? Now, is the consequence of that good or not? Right? All things considered. Right? So, well, it's good. I'm giving nasiha. Right? But that's why, if you consider the consequences, that will the consequences be pleasing to Allah, all things considered? That is an angelic inspiration. Those things whose likely consequences are harmful, all things considered, that is a khatir, nafsani or shaitani, depending on whether it is directing towards the harmful thing, or whim. Right? Whim is that which is without clear purpose, or that which is towards random harm. I just said it, right? So that's why Ruwaym bin Ahmad said, "Man raqab al-awaqib salim." It's one of my favorite quotes. Whoever is mindful of consequences remains safe. So that's, with respect to bad thoughts, right? So he tells us, rahimahullah ta'ala, ومداواتها رد تلك الخواطر في الابتداء لئلا تستحكم. The cure for bad thoughts is to reject such inspirations right away, right? Meaning right when they occur, lest they take control. Because the more you consider the bad thought, تستحكم, it starts taking control. Right? وذلك, so how do you do that? How do you reject them right away? He says, وذلك بذكر الدائم. That is by constant remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وملازمة الخوف, and holding fast to awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's second. والعلم بأن الله تعالى يعلم ما في سرك كما يعرف الخلق ما في علانيتك. And the third is to have knowledge that Allah knows all that you hide, just as creation knows the things that you make apparent. فتستحي أن تصلح للخلق موضع نظرهم ولا تصلح موضع نظرك موضع نظر الحق. So you feel shy of caring more for rectifying your outward, which is what people see, and you don't take care of rectifying your inward, which is what Allah, the Lord of people, beholds. Right? Shyness before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وإن يعني وقد قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, because the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم said, إن الله تعالى لا ينظر إلى صوركم. Allah Most High does not look merely at your forms. ولا إلى أعمالكم, right? Nor at your actions. ولكن, meaning merely your actions. The more famous narration, ولا إلى أجسامكم, nor at your bodies. ولكن ينظر إلى قلوبكم. Rather, He looks at your hearts. And in some narrations, rather He looks at your hearts, وأعمالكم, and your actions. Rather, He looks at your hearts. And your thoughts are those meanings that revolve around your heart. So when the bad thought comes, He says, leave it for Allah. Right? Leave it for Allah. Right? And we explained how. Right? Because embracing bad thoughts is embracing something that is displeasing to Allah. Whether it be sinful or reprehensible or harmful. Right? All these bad thoughts, whether the thought is of related to belief and disbelief, whether it's related to virtue and vice, whether it's related to good and bad, right and wrong, right? The bad thoughts, the disbelief, the vice, the disbelief, the misguidance, the vice, the wrong, the blameworthy, all of those are thoughts that are not pleasing to Allah. So just like we wouldn't normally go out in an appearance that would be displeasing to people. Today I was about to wear a thobe. I was told that there was oil stains on it because yesterday we had Nahari, and that's an immersive experience. But I was told, you can't go out like that. Okay? Right? Then how do we present ourselves in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And we're always in the presence of Allah, with stained hearts. Nasallallahu al-afiyah. So then he quotes with his chain of transmission from Yahya ibn Mu'adh al-Razi, who said, what is the quote? Yeah. So he says, وَسَمِعْتُ أَبَا بَكْرٍ الرَّازِي يقول سمعت أبا الحسن العلوي صاحب إبراهيم الخواص يقول سمعت إبراهيم الخواص رحمه الله تعالى يقول. So he mentions with his chain of transmission that Ibrahim al-Khawas, one of the great Imams of the Salaf, say, أول ذنب الخطرة. Right? That the beginning of sin is the bad thought. Right? فإن تدركها صاحبها بالكراهية وإلا صارت معارضة فإن تداركها صاحبها بالرد وإلا صارت وسوسة فإن تداركها صاحبها بالمجاهدة وإلا هاج منها الشهوة مع طلب الهوى فيوطى العقل والعلم والبيان. Right? So he said that the beginning of sin is the bad thought. So if you ward it off by disliking it, then you've done your job. Right? And the first bad thought is the easiest to dislodge. You dislike it, you turn away from it, but then if you remain with it, then what happens? Right? Otherwise, it becomes stronger. Right? It's not just a bad thought that you can just dispel. Sarat mu'arida. It starts opposing you. Right? Because it's like someone knocks on the door. You ignore them, they can't come in. Right? Like someone, you don't want to answer, you don't want the bad guest. You just look outside, nah. So you don't say anything to it. But if you open the door, yes, what do you want? Now it'll be harder to close the door. Right? And if you start having a conversation, it's a really bad thought, it may force itself in. And then the more time you spend with the bad thought, the more trouble it'll give. And if you let it come inside your hallway, then and it wants to stay, then you'll have bigger trouble. The simple thing is, keep the door closed. Right? And if it may knock 3 times, and eventually it'll go away. And if you keep responding to the knock of the bad thought, guess what's going to happen? More of them will come. Because you answer the door. Who do telemarketers call? The people who answer their calls. Right? So similarly, you ward it off by disliking. Otherwise, it becomes stronger. And then it requires active rejection. In the beginning, it just requires you dislike it, ignore it. But then, if you entertain the bad thoughts, then you have to reject it. That's harder. Right? And then if you continue to entertain it, it becomes misgivings. Because now you're having a conversation with it. And that requires mujahada, striving. So you say, what do you want? Say, oh, I want to talk to you. So okay, come in. And now you're going back and forth. You're having small talk with a bad thought. So now you have to end the conversation. But it's like, if you imagine the door rather than a phone call, you let them in to your house, 'cause it's winter. Right? So you let them into your house. Then you have to shove them out, because they don't want to go. Right? And if you allow them to remain inside, then they're going to settle. Right? And they can become bad traits. It says, otherwise, desires and whims can take over. They'll move in and they'll run your house. Right? And they can take away reason, knowledge, and clear action. Because they're now living with you. Okay? And if you allow enough of them in, there'll be upheaval. Right? So reject right away by, and the key is, remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is one of the qualities that requires, consideration. Right? He begins in his look at the blameworthy traits, at really foundational spiritual skills, right? That are the central ones. You'll see the later ones are built upon these, and the khawatir are particularly important in that. And one of the components that for treating bad thoughts is muraqabah. Right? Imam Zarruq says that one has to have vigilance over oneself. And they say the beginning of vigilance is alam ya'lam anna Allah yara. Do they not know that Allah is beholding them? And this reminding oneself, Allah is beholding me. And Allah is beholding you both with respect to your outward actions, and He's beholding you with respect to your thoughts. And of the two, your thoughts are where you should put your focus on, because the outward actions are just the result of inward thoughts. Right? Right? That's number one. The second reason bad thoughts occur, Imam Zarruq adds, is lack of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why when they say that dhikru nur, remembrance is light, right? It dispels doubts, it dispels whims, it dispels desires, etc. But one has to hold fast to the remembrance. And that's one of the benefits of consistency in one's spiritual routines. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us that. Right? And of course, each of these, is the struggle of a lifetime, right? But we're pointing in the direction of what the author mentions, because you can't all of spirituality could be seen as the science of thoughts, okay? Right? Or it could be seen, each of these is a foundational spiritual skill. But this extent is is sufficient for one who would reflect. So practically, ask yourself, where is this thought from? What is its consequence? Right? And only accept wholesome thoughts. If the thought is a divine inspiration, it's an angelic inspiration, embrace it. If it's just much of our thoughts are in the realm of the nafs. It just, I feel like I want. I feel like I want. I feel like I want. And the answer to that is no. Okay? And you think of and you try to turn, and some of those, the minimum thing is, the spiritual minimalism is if your selfish thoughts are impermissible, you reject. But spiritual intelligence is that any selfish thought, you turn it into an angelic direction, which is either channeling that thought towards that angelic meanings, or sometimes you realize that something else would be better. So you wanted to have, today I'm going to eat 1 pound of baklava. And I'll take it to the hub. Then you say, you know what? I don't know if they need a few kilos of baklava at the hub. I'll just make a donation, right? Maybe more beneficial. But then nafs might say, what about the baklava? I say, I'm sure they'll probably serve sweets on Friday, so I'll have them. Or you say, well, I'll have a little bit, right? And have gratitude. Right? So you channel it. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us insight. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa nabiyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallama tasliman kathira.
Thank you for listening to the Rawha, Daily Guidance for Seekers with Shaykh Faraz Rabbani. Help Seekers Hub give light to millions around the world by supporting us through monthly donations by going to seekershub.org/donate. Your donations are tax deductible in the US and Canada.